You can't be serious. $10,000 for garbage. My men threw that wood over your fence because nobody wanted it. The man's voice was a sharp, metallic thing in the dry summer air, accustomed to cutting through noise and dissent on a factory floor. His name was Arthur Sterling, and his suit, though dusty from the ride out, was cut from a cloth finer than anything seen in this county for a decade. He gestured with a clean, uncalloused hand toward the far edge of the property, where a series of immense, orderly stacks of wood stood like the silent ruins of some ancient city, baking in the relentless sun. They were grayed by weather, silvered by time, and arranged with a geometric precision that was unnerving. They were, to his eye, the largest, most pointless collection of refuse he had ever seen. He had come to buy a right-of-way, a simple negotiation with a poor widow for a sliver of her useless land. He had not expected this. He had not expected her. My men threw that wood over your fence because nobody wanted it, he repeated, slower this time, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. Abigail stood on the porch of the small ranch house, her hands resting on the worn railing. She was 40 years old, but the sun and the work had carved her face into something that looked both older and ageless. She did not seem angry, or insulted, or even particularly interested in the disbelief radiating from Mr. Sterling. She simply watched him, her gaze as steady and patient as the horizon. Behind him, a younger man in a surveyor's vest shuffled his feet, looking from his boss to the woman and back again, a ledger held awkwardly in his hands. He was the one from the railroad, the one who understood the true cost of things. Abigail's eyes met the surveyor's for a fleeting second, and then returned to Sterling. "That's not what I'm selling," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. "The land is one price. The wood is another." It had started 20 years before, in the summer of 1868. The silence then was a different kind. It was the raw, hollow silence that comes after a life has been abruptly extinguished. Thomas, her husband, had been gone for 3 months, the victim of a fever that had swept through without fanfare and left behind a wake of quiet devastation. The ranch, his dream, was now hers. 160 acres of dusty plains, a small, sturdy house he had built with his own hands, and a debt to the bank that felt as vast and unconquerable as the sky itself. She was 20 years old. The quiet was a physical weight, pressing in on her from all sides. Then one afternoon, a new sound broke the stillness. It was the rumble of a heavy wagon, the jangle of harnesses, and then a loud, percussive clatter as a load of wood was unceremoniously dumped over her back fence line, the one that abutted the sprawling property of the Blackwood Furniture Company. She went out to look. It was a pile of offcuts, scrap ends, pieces of oak and cherry with knots or splits that made them useless for the fine cabinets and tables the factory produced. It was garbage. The next day, another wagon came. And the day after that. For a week, she watched the pile grow, a strange and unwelcome intrusion into the landscape of her grief. It was an insult, a daily reminder of her proximity to the town's industry, a town she and Thomas had deliberately kept at arm's length. On the 8th day, she put on her least-worn dress, tied her hair back severely, and walked the 2 miles to the factory. The air there hummed with the scream of a massive steam-powered saw and smelled richly of sawdust and varnish. She found the foreman, a young man named Ben whose face was perpetually smudged with grease and wood dust. He was busy, distracted, shouting orders over the din. She had to wait for a lull when the great saw was being reset. "Excuse me," she said, her voice feeling small in the cavernous space. He turned, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "You're dumping your scrap wood on my property," she stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. He squinted, then recognition dawned. "Oh, right. The widow's place. Sorry about that. The old dumping ground's full. We just needed a spot for a bit. It's a problem, I know." He seemed to expect her to demand he stop, to demand he clean it up. He was already calculating the man-hours it would take. She surprised him. "I don't want you to move it." He paused, the rag halfway to his pocket. "You don't?" "No," she said. "I have a proposition. You can continue to use my fence line as your dumping ground. I won't complain. I won't ask you to move it. All I ask is that what you dump becomes mine. It's my property the moment it crosses the fence. Ben stared at her. He saw a young woman, plainly dressed, her face shadowed with loss. He saw the practicality of her request, not the strategy. It would save him a considerable headache. Finding a new place to dump the tons of scrap the factory generated each month was a problem he had been putting off for weeks. It would cost money, time. This strange woman was offering him a solution for free. "You want our garbage?" he asked, a flicker of pity in his eyes. He assumed she meant to use it for firewood, a meager way to save a few dollars through the winter. It was a sad, sensible kind of poverty. "Yes," she said. "I want your garbage." "All right then," he said with a shrug, the decision made in an instant. "Fine by me. Saves me the trouble. Dump it all you want, boys," he yelled to a pair of nearby workers, who just nodded. He turned back to her. "It's yours, all of it." He made a note on a scrap of paper, a quick, informal record of the agreement, more to protect the company than to honor her claim. June 14, 1868. Per agreement with Mrs. Abigail Miller, scrap wood dumped at West Fence Line is considered forfeit, property of landowner. No charge, no liability. He filed it away in a dusty cabinet and promptly forgot all about it. He had, without knowing it, just signed away a fortune. Abigail walked back to the ranch, the dust from the road coating the hem of her dress. She didn't look back. She carried with her a verbal contract and the first faint outline of a plan born from one of Thomas's old habits. He had been a carpenter, not a fancy one like the men at the factory, but a good one. He had kept a journal, and in it, he had written down things he believed. One line, underlined twice, stuck in her mind, wood holds time. The value of a good piece of timber isn't just in its grain, but in its patience. A green board is a promise. A seasoned board is a fact. Her brother, Samuel, came to visit that autumn. He was a practical man, a farmer from 2 counties over, and he was worried about her. He arrived to find her not just surviving, but engaged in a bizarre new form of labor. Every evening, after her chores were done, she would go out to the steadily growing mountain of wood with a wagon and a sharpened axe. She wasn't chopping it for firewood, not most of it. She was sorting it. She would pull out the planks of oak, the offcuts of walnut, the gnarled burls of cherry. She split the unusable, not ridden pieces for her stove, but the rest she began to stack. Not in a pile, but in careful, crisscrossing layers that allowed the air to circulate. "Abigail, what is all this?" Samuel asked, standing beside a stack of cherry wood that was already taller than he was. The scent of the raw wood was sharp and sweet on the cool air. "It's from the factory," she said, not stopping her work. She used a small hand-forged froe, one of Thomas's tools, to split a small log for kindling, the blade making a satisfying thwack as it bit into the wood. "I can see that. But what are you doing with it?" "You have enough firewood here for 10 winters." His brow was furrowed with concern. He saw his grieving sister, alone on this vast and empty ranch, engaging in a pointless, back-breaking hobby. He saw obsession, a way of channeling her sorrow into mindless work. "It's not all for fire," she said. She picked up a length of quarter-sawn oak, its grain straight and tight. "This is good wood, Samuel. They throw it away because it's too short for a table leg or has a flaw on one edge. But the wood itself is good." "Good for what?" "Building what?" "You can't build a house from scraps." "I'm not building anything," she said, and for the first time, she stopped and looked at him. "I'm waiting." He didn't understand. Waiting for what? For it to be ready. That night, after he had gone to bed in the spare room, shaking his head at her strange new fixation, she sat at the small kitchen table. She opened a fresh ledger, the kind used for farm accounts. On the first page, in neat, careful script, she wrote the date, October 5, 1868. Below it, she began her inventory. Oak, white, approximate 200 board feet, mixed lengths. Cherry, black, approximate 80 board feet, many small cuts. Walnut, 12 planks, floored. She was not just collecting wood. She was curating it. She was keeping its history. Samuel left the next morning, pressing a few dollars into her hand and telling her to take care of herself, his eyes full of a pity she did not want. He told her she should think about selling the ranch, moving closer to him and his family. The work was too much for a woman alone. He saw a scrap heap. She saw an investment, paid for not in coin, but in time and sweat. She saw the beginning of her empire. At 25, the piles were no longer just piles. They were organized ranges, small hills of timber separated by species. There was the Oak Hill, the Cherry Rise, the Walnut Ridge. The townspeople who rode past on the main road, a half-mile distant, could see the strange new topography of her land. They called her the Scrap Widow. It was not always meant unkindly, but it was a name that marked her as an eccentric, a woman defined by her husband's death and her bizarre, monumental hobby. Her hands, once soft, were now permanently calloused, her palms a roadmap of hard labor. Her back was a column of solid muscle. She learned the language of the wood. She could tell by the weight and the ring of a piece how dry it was. She could read the history of a tree in the patterns of its grain. The factory, under Ben's continued, forgetful supervision, kept delivering. Wagons arrived twice, sometimes 3 times a week, their contents adding to her collection. The sound of the wood clattering over the fence was no longer an intrusion, it was the regular, rhythmic pulse of her life's work. At 30, she had a crisis. A summer of violent thunderstorms culminated in a flash flood. The creek that bordered her property to the south swelled its banks, the muddy water creeping up the pasture. Her first thought was not for the house, nor for the chickens in their coop. It was for the wood. The oldest stacks, the ones that had been curing for a decade, were on the lowest ground. For 2 days and nights, with the rain lashing down, she worked with a feverish intensity. Using the old farm wagon and her mule, she hauled load after load of the precious, aging timber to the highest point on her property, near the house. She worked until her muscles screamed and she was covered from head to toe in mud. She saved the wood. The water rose to the edge of her porch and soaked the bottom 2 feet of the oldest oak stack, but the heart of her collection was safe. When the water receded, it left behind a layer of silt on everything. Her small vegetable garden was ruined. The lower pasture was a swamp. But the wood, her decade of labor, was secure. That year, she used the roughest of the pine and poplar scraps, the wood she didn't bother to catalog, to build proper drying racks, raising the most valuable planks off the ground, ensuring they would never be threatened by dampness again. At 35, the scale of her operation had become breathtaking. The stacks were now 20 feet high in places, long, orderly cordilleras of lumber that stretched for over 100 yards along the fence line. She had filled 17 ledgers. Each one was a meticulous record of acquisition and condition. May 3, 1883. Walnut, black, 14 planks, 8-foot lengths, 2-inch thickness. Clear grain. From sterling order number for 12, label attached. She had begun to take the small paper labels from the finest pieces, pasting them into her journals. She knew the factory's production cycles better than some of its own employees. She knew when they were working on a big commission of walnut desks for the state capitol, and when they were building cherry bedroom sets for a wealthy merchant in the city. She knew their wood. It was in this year that the old sign for the Blackwood Furniture Company came down. A new, larger sign, painted in bold gold letters, went up in its place, Sterling Fine Furnishings. Quality without compromise. Mr. Arthur Sterling, the founder's son-in-law, had taken over. He was a man of efficiency and modernization. He expanded the factory, invested in a new, more powerful steam engine, and fired many of the older hands, including the foreman, Ben, who retired to a small farm and never gave the arrangement with the scrap widow a second thought. The dumping continued, now carried out by younger men who only knew that this was the designated spot. To them, it was just a strange local custom, dumping prime hardwood scraps onto the property of an eccentric recluse. The irony was not lost on Abigail. Mr. Sterling, in his pursuit of quality, was more wasteful than his predecessor. His standards were higher. A plank with the slightest imperfection, a color variation that only a master craftsman would notice, was now deemed scrap. The quality of the wood arriving over her fence actually improved. Her collection swelled with magnificent pieces of tiger maple, bird's eye maple, and quarter-sawn white oak that would have been prized lumber just a few years earlier. She dutifully collected it all, stacking it, cataloguing it, and waiting. The oldest wood, the pieces from that first year, was now approaching 20 years of age. It was no longer just wood. It was something else entirely. It was hard as iron, stable as stone, its color deepened to a rich, lustrous patina that no varnish could replicate. It was perfectly, exquisitely seasoned hardwood, the kind of material that builders of fine instruments or luxury rail cars would pay a king's ransom for, if they could even find it. On the open frontier, where most available lumber was green pine, warped and prone to splitting, her collection was not just an asset, it was an anomaly, a treasure hoard hidden in plain sight. The first hint of the changing world arrived not as a wagon of wood, but as two men with a tripod and a measuring chain. Surveyors. She watched from her porch as they worked their way across the plains, driving stakes into the ground with methodical thuds. They were charting the path for the new railroad spur, the one that would connect the main line to the town, transforming it from a sleepy outpost into a proper commercial hub. She watched them measure a path that cut directly across the corner of her property, the very corner where her 20 years of labor stood stacked and silent. She felt no alarm. Only a deep, quiet sense of inevitability. She went inside, brewed a cup of tea, and opened her most recent ledger. She began to calculate totals, running her finger down the long columns of figures. Board feet of oak. Board feet of walnut. Board feet of cherry. 20 years of patience, distilled into numbers. The time for waiting was almost over. The time for building her empire was about to begin. She was ready. Mr. Arthur Sterling looked at his own set of ledgers, spread across a polished desk in his spacious office. The numbers were good. The factory was more profitable than ever. But the railroad represented a new level of opportunity. A spur line, with a depot in town and a siding running directly to his factory, would cut his shipping costs in half and open up markets across the entire country. He had already negotiated with the railroad company. They would fund the main spur if he could secure the land for the siding. It was a simple matter. A few acres from the township, a right-of-way from the neighboring farm, and a final, insignificant sliver of land from the widow on the old Miller ranch. He had sent his assistant to make an initial offer. A generous one, he thought. $500 for a useless corner of her property. An hour later, his assistant had returned, flustered. The offer had been politely refused. The widow, he was told, would only discuss the matter with Mr. Sterling himself. So now he was here, standing in the dust, his fine suit feeling ridiculous, his patience wearing thin. He saw a stubborn, backward woman living in the past, clinging to a pile of rotting firewood out of sentiment or madness. He saw an obstacle to progress, his progress. He followed her gaze to the railroad surveyor, a man named Peters, who had accompanied him at the railroad's insistence. Mr. Peters, Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension, perhaps you can explain to Mrs. Miller that the price for undeveloped grazing land in this county is $5 an acre. I am offering her 100 times that for a single acre. It is more than generous. Peters, the surveyor, did not look at Abigail. He was looking at the wood. He had been looking at it since they arrived. He was a practical man, an engineer. He saw not a junk pile, but neatly stacked, organized timber. He walked over to the nearest stack, a towering wall of grayed oak. He pulled a small knife from his pocket and, with a practiced motion, scraped away a small section of the weathered surface. Underneath, the wood was a rich, honeyed gold, the grain tight and straight. He tapped it with his knuckle. It made a sharp, ringing sound, like stone. This wood, Peters said, his voice low and thoughtful, it's been here a while. It's been here 20 years, Abigail said calmly from the porch. Some of it longer. Sterling scoffed. It's firewood. Rotting firewood. There's no rot here, Mr. Sterling, Peters corrected him quietly, running his hand over the exposed grain. This is white oak. Quarter sawn. It's been air-drying for 2 decades. It's perfectly seasoned. I've never seen anything like it. He turned to look at the other stacks. Is that black walnut over there? It is, Abigail confirmed. 15 years seasoned. The cherry next to it is mostly 12-inch. Sterling stared between the engineer and the widow, a sense of profound confusion beginning to dawn on him. This was not the conversation he had expected. He was here to talk about land, about progress, about money, he understood. They were talking about garbage as if it were gold. He felt the solid ground of his authority begin to shift beneath his feet. He had misjudged the situation. He had misjudged the woman. I don't understand, Sterling said, the bluster gone from his voice. What does this have to do with anything? Mr. Sterling, Peters said, turning to face him fully, his expression serious. The company is not just building a railroad. We're building luxury passenger cars. We're building a new depot in town, with a first-class ticket office and a restaurant. The specifications call for seasoned hardwood. Oak for the car frames, walnut and cherry for the interior paneling and furniture. We've been trying to source it for months. The prices from back east are astronomical, and the shipping is a nightmare. We've been planning to use green timber and hope for the best, but it will warp, it will shrink. He gestured to the mountains of wood surrounding them. This is what we need. This isn't just wood. This is a solution. This is a miracle. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Sterling looked at the wood, really looked at it for the first time. He saw not scraps, but inventory. He saw not garbage, but a commodity of immense value, a resource he had been casually discarding for his entire career. He saw 20 years of his own company's waste, transformed by one woman's patience into an asset more valuable than the land it sat on. The full, crushing weight of his miscalculation settled upon him. He had thrown away a fortune, and now he was going to have to buy it back. Abigail stepped off the porch. She was holding one of her ledgers. She walked over to where the 2 men stood and opened it on the hood of Sterling's own carriage. The pages were filled with her neat, precise script, column after column of dates, wood types, and board feet. This is the oak, she said, her finger tracing a line. From 1868 to 1878. Approximately 40,000 board feet. It's fully seasoned. The price for that is $3 per board foot. The walnut, from 1873 to 1883, is about 15,000 board feet. That's more valuable. I'll take $4 for that. The cherry. She continued, her voice even and methodical, listing her inventory and her prices. It was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. Peters, the railroad man, was nodding, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and professional excitement. He was doing the math in his head, and he knew that even at her prices, it was a bargain. It would save the railroad tens of thousands of dollars and months of delays. Sterling felt a wave of dizziness. The numbers she was quoting were astronomical. They dwarfed the price of the land. He looked at her face, searching for a sign of triumph, of gloating. He found none. There was only a quiet, unshakable certainty. She had known the value of his garbage from the very first day. She had simply waited for the world to catch up. You can't be serious, he whispered, the words a hollow echo of his earlier arrogance. $10,000 for garbage. My final offer is not $10,000, Abigail said, closing the ledger. The sound was soft, but final. That was just for the walnut. The total for the lumber required for your rail cars and the depot, plus the 1 acre of land for your siding, is $94,700. Payable in gold coin or a bank draft from the First National Bank of Denver. I will also require a contract for all of your factory's hardwood scrap for the next 10 years. At a price of 10 cents per board foot, she paused. I believe you'll find my terms are more than fair. Mr. Sterling looked from her face to the endless stacks of wood, to the railroad engineer who was watching him with an expectant look. He saw the future of his company, his reputation, his grand plans for expansion, all resting on the whim of the scrap widow. He had come to bully a poor woman into selling her land. He was leaving as a supplicant, forced to buy back his own magnificent, squandered waste at a price she alone would set. He had spent 20 years building a company on the principle of quality without compromise. She had spent the same 20 years building an empire on the value of what he had compromised on every single day. He opened his mouth to argue, to protest, but no words came. There was nothing to say. He had been beaten. Beaten by patience. Beaten by a woman who saw value where he had only seen trash. He gave a single, sharp nod. The deal was done. 2 years later, the railroad spur was complete. The sound of the train's whistle was now a daily feature of the landscape, a call that echoed across the plains. The Sterling Fine Furnishings factory had a direct line to the outside world, and business was booming. Mr. Sterling, a humbler and wiser man, personally oversaw the delivery of his scrap wood to Abigail's property, where it was now weighed and paid for according to their contract. Abigail's ranch was smaller, the corner with the siding now belonging to the railroad, but her house was the same. She had a new barn, a new well, and a bank account that made her one of the wealthiest individuals in the territory. But she still lived simply. Most of the great woodpiles were gone, sold to the railroad and to other buyers who now came to her for her legendary seasoned lumber. But she had kept a small section for herself, the oldest and finest pieces from the first few years. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, she would walk out to the stacks and run her hand over the silvered, weathered planks. She could feel the 20 years of sun and wind and patience stored within them. She would think of Thomas and the simple truth he had written in his journal. Time is the finest tool. It doesn't carve or cut, but it transforms. It turns green wood into treasure, a grieving girl into a quiet queen, and a pile of garbage into the foundations of an empire. And you, what have you been given that you mistake for garbage? What resource has been laid at your feet, dismissed by the world as worthless? What long, patient work are you being called to, the kind that pays its dividends not in days or weeks, but in decades? Look closely at the scraps. Look at what others throw away. For in the patient accumulation of the overlooked, in the quiet curation of the discarded, you might just find the raw material to build a life of unshakable value. You might find your own empire, waiting silently for time to reveal its worth.